When we finished the last episode of Reflections last year, it catalogued a year's angling that I really didn't think would ever be eclipsed. And although 2020 has been a shocking year for so many people in so many ways, in angling terms, it's been mind-blowing for me, and I'm not sure why. Give a nod to the carp gods in the skies. They played a big role, a lot of luck, a lot of hard work. It's been jaw-dropping, and you join me here back at the syndicate where a lot of that's taken place, which is Grendon in Northamptonshire. And I'm going to be fishing a 48-hour session. Hopefully going to try and, well, I'm going to try definitely, but hopefully I'll extract a winter carp for you guys. But that's no mean feat really, even though the weather is really good. No excuses there. But yeah, we're going to fish a session, and during that I'm going to recap the year, the memories, the stories. It all unfolds here. The light's really dropping away now, and it's perfect time for seeing a fish somewhere. It's been really, all of the fishing has been based on this, not just here, but everywhere you go in the winter, the first part of the night is when they show. So I'm not going to set up unless I don't see anything. I mean, the latest I've set up is usually sort of 10, 11, midnight, something like that, and by then you should have seen one or heard one. But if I don't, then I'm just going to drop onto an area that I've been baiting for the night. But for the next few hours, it's keep them peeled, because really it's pivotal. The whole session hinges on what I might or might not see in the next few hours, so I'm going to stay on it. Well, it's been dark for getting on for 4 hours now, and nothing has showed, and it reminds me back when we were younger men, and whenever the roach were active, even no matter how cold it was, we'd catch a carp. And whenever the roach weren't active, we never used to catch a carp or see a carp. And it reminds me very much of that, because the roach has been very active the last few weeks, even last week when it was bitterly cold. And tonight, this evening, this afternoon, not seen one roach, and I certainly haven't seen or heard a carp. So what I'm going to do is keep my ears and eyes open, but I'm going to put rods out onto a couple of spots that I've kept baited that have done me a couple of bites recently, and fish for liners, and then take it from there. And it's a long night. We've got a lot of time in front of us, but yeah, get the rods out, and then I'll take the sounder box, I'll do a couple of short walks around, keep listening, keep watching, and hopefully as the session progresses I'll be able to pin them down. I'm sure as the session progresses there'll be something to see, something to go on. Just need that one sign, but you know, it could all be about the liners. You know, the water's very cold now. Although we've got good weather now, it has been brutally cold. So the liners could be the one. That could be the factor of determination. That might be the one thing that tells us where they are. So it's going to be all about having the right drop, the right line lay, the right sensitivity. We'll figure this out. We'll work out where they are. Well, the rods are out, and I don't know what the time is. It's probably about 9:30, 10 o'clock, something like that. So probably now is about the time I'd expect them to be most active. It's been a good bite time through the autumn period and into the beginning of the winter. We have got incredible weather, very mild weather for mid-December, and the lake seems dead, which is really odd, but you know, sometimes it's like that. So everything's set to fish for liners, hopefully, if they're about. If I don't get any liners at all, then I'm going to be moving swims tomorrow. But I've got a feeling we'll get some liners, and that'll give us something to work with. And I'm going to spend the next couple of hours watching and listening, And if I hear them anywhere else, then it's going to be a pack up and a move. But in the meantime, they're out on spots that have done fish recently. It's all to play for. My passion for fishing that started in 1983, that led to my first carp in 1985, has been everything that's really thrust my life forward in various directions, and it's been my lifeblood in every literal sense that you can imagine. Time is short, life is short, and you know, if we could fish for the rest of our lives, in my opinion, there still wouldn't be enough time. There's too many beautiful fish and beautiful lakes out there, so every time I go after one, I want to make it count, and you've got to tick a lot of boxes to get that right. Beautiful morning after quite a pleasantly hospitable night, about 5 or 6 degrees, no frost, really nice. And very, very, very quiet in terms of liners, definitely in the wrong spot and need to move. But the fish don't normally show first light on here, even in the summer. It's not a very good time to see them. It's quite an enigmatic rule breaker of a carp lake in a lot of ways. But this morning I've seen a couple of shows, very, very subtle. You could easily mistake them for things other than carp, but two or three of them were definitely carp, and followed a couple of bubbles coming up in the area. So I've moved a couple of rods where I saw those first 2 bits of activity when it was still only half light this morning. They were very early. Since then I've seen a couple more in a similar sort of area. Just about to move another rod, and then I've got to decide whether or not I'm going to fish it from where I put the rods or move to the other side of the bay and cast across, which gives me a few more options, a bit more space. So going to assess it as the day goes on. We're narrowing the hunt down, hopefully. I've been waiting for a ticket for Grendon Lake up in Northamptonshire for quite a few years, and Laney was the first person to flag me on it 5 years ago or so, and it had been on the radar and had my name down and so on, and ticket came up this year, which was a very pleasant surprise and kind of diverted me from other plans. But that's what happens when you've got your name down on a few different things. That's what I always say to people, you know, don't worry about how long it takes for your name to come up, just get your name down. Longest I ever waited for a ticket was 11 years, and sometimes, quite often hear people say, oh yeah, but the waiting list is 5 years. Well, if you don't put your name down, you are never getting a ticket, fact. So just put your name down and forget about them, and then when they come up, you can decide whether or not you want to do it. And that's what happened here. So the ticket came up, and suddenly I was faced with a mission to catch a potential mid-50 common, which caught the imagination somewhat. So the lake in question, as I said, it's up in Northamptonshire. It's about 15 to 18 acres and home to about 45 carp, topped by the king of the lake, Tyson, which has gone over 56 pounds now. So some very, very serious stock. It's a lake that is dominated by commons, probably, let me think, probably 80% of the carp in the lake are commons. They are some of the most incredible fish that you'll set eyes on. One of which in particular, which we'll get to in a little while, is arguably, in my opinion, one of the best in the country. But yeah, it's dominated by commons. There's a few mirrors, which are really, really nice. Some of the fish are very, very old. You've got your typical Neem Valley grey, slate grey commons, which are really appealing and quite unique to this sort of area. On that, you've got a syndicate of about 35 people. So 15 swims, 15 odd acres, 35 members. It's going to be busy anyway, you know, even if you add 20 members, they're going to be down there a lot because the calibre of the fish is so good. But this year, of course, carp angling went up several notches in terms of bankside presence, just because of furlough and everything that went with it, you know. So carp fishing received a massive shot in the arm, and of course all the lakes were really busy. So even from the get-go, coming up here, you're faced with dealing with lots of other anglers. There's a 3-night limit in place at the beginning. Actually, for the first month or two, it was a 2-night limit because of the furlough situation. But I think people always ask me about nice quiet syndicates, you know, I don't even know if they really exist. If you've got a lake with lots of good fishing, then you've got to expect busy and competitive fishing. And that's certainly 2 things that you need to get your head around if you're going to fish up here at Grendon. So it's been an interesting journey. You know, when you first take on any kind of new mission, your head is full of trepidation, anticipation, and a complex set of emotions as you do that first drive up the motorway. You know, it was a 2.5 hour odd drive from where I was living in Chelmsford in Essex, and I remember that first journey vividly, because that is when I remember every roundabout, every bit of it, you're wrestling that complex set of emotions that I just mentioned, and thinking what's going to await you, what's going to happen as the days, the weeks, the months, maybe even the years unfold. You know, some missions can take a long time, but I was determined to try and figure it out. It's known not to be an easy lake, but by the same token, I think it'd be fair to say it's not the most difficult in the world either. So a typical return for, you know, the top rods, if you call them that, would be in a region of about 20 fish a year out of those 45, with the rest of the syndicate taking anything from 0 to a couple of fish, maybe a few more. So, you know, it's challenging but not impossible at all. So when I came up for my first session, faced with a lake which is surrounded by satellite lakes, which are all on the same ticket, and none of the other ones really get fished at all and represent a real unknown quantity. So I actually spent the first day walking miles and miles and climbing tree after tree. It was just like the most incredibly exciting, intoxicating first date that you could ever imagine. I was just like, I was down there, then I was over there, then I was up there, and all over the whole site. There's a 45-acre lake at the back and a few others, and I was determined to walk around until I found some fish that had never been caught. I thought the main lake can wait, you know. It was busy, the fish are known, and the thought of finding an unknown fish somewhere was really, really galvanised me. But you know what? That first day I walked and looked and looked and looked until I was shredded and bitten and soaked in salt stains and everything from the sweat. And you know what? I didn't see one single carp anywhere on the site. And I even found a shoal of big bream deep down on the marginal shelf of the 45-acre lake. I got up to the top of this really high tree, which was a bit risky actually, but I managed to get up the top of this, and I was swaying on the end of this breeze, and I thought they were carp. I thought, my God, I found these carp on the big lake. And then as I looked, I realised they were bream, massive bream, all mid-doubles or bigger. And they came along the shelf and then disappeared, and that was it. That was all I saw in a whole day. And I came back here in the evening, chatted to Tim Bottomley, who was the guy that I met at the gate, a northern guy that I'd fished with in the late 90s, really, really cracking guy, and came back to the lake, and Tim looked at me, I must have looked a right mess, and he said, "You're going to have a go on here then?" I said, "Yeah, I think I'll fish on here for tonight. I haven't seen anything anywhere." And that's how it started. I got some rods out, and I had a mindset of how I was going to fish it, which was just going to be fish wherever I see fish and then bait with boilies. And turned out I was completely and utterly wrong on that. I was reading through the diaries that I keep a couple of days ago, where I was writing some of the sessions up for my carpology piece, and the amount of sufferance and mental anguish that I went through in those first few trips was first couple of trips was quite considerable, and the amount of swims that you fish and dealing with all the obstacles at the same time you're trying to learn. And yeah, there was the floaters, my God. I mean, the floaters, on the first session I had, and the second session I had floater opportunities, and on the second occasion I managed to get a couple of fish take in, a few, and then the gulls arrived, and this is where it got really weird. So I'm used to dealing with gulls, you know, for floater fishing. They never faze me at all, but the gulls on here are like some glitch in the Matrix gulls. They're like, I don't know how they've evolved different to all the other gulls I've ever had to deal with, but on every occasion that I've been faced with them, I feed off every other bird life on here. Two massive swans, geese, ducks, but the same flock of 50 seagulls, you cannot stop. And I haven't quite figured out how or why this works. You know, I've fed the swans till they go to sleep on the peninsula and just sit there preening themselves lazily in the sun, and still the gulls are going. And it's like they've developed some kind of constant conveyor belt system of digestion. Like it goes in, goes through them and comes out. You just cannot stop them. And I've gone through 20 kilos a day of cheap biscuits, and just to try and feed them off, and you just can't stop them. And I've never experienced that anywhere. And my hate affair with the Grendon seagulls began then and lasted the entirety of the summer. I dread to think how many opportunities were robbed away from me, and I tried everything. And one day was quite funny actually. I decided that the next time that the seagulls were, this was a bit later on in the summer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an entire sack of cheap dog biscuits, and wherever I find the carp, I'll go the opposite side, furthest away from it, and I'll put the whole sack of these dog biscuits in, and let the seagulls eat them. I tried similar things throughout the summer, but they hadn't really worked. But I thought I never would give up, because I knew that you only just need this one chance on a floater and something really special could happen, which did actually end up happening, but a few months later. But so on this particular day, the carp were in this particular area, and I thought, no, right, don't fire anything out, just deal with the gulls. So I went to the van, got this sack, carried this massive hunk of dog biscuits down to the back of the arm, and the seagulls have followed me, and they came over and ripped open this sack of floaters, got me scoop, and I started like Quint shoveling the chum in jaws. I was shoveling these in, and seagulls are going berserk above me, and they're all coming in screaming, like a ball of white feathers above me. Shoveling, I'm thinking, right, this is it. And I'm looking up, and I'll just shovel a couple more. And I've looked down, there's no floaters. I had a whole sack of sinking biscuits. What an absolute idiot. And they've all sunk just there, right? Which wouldn't have been too big a deal, apart from the fact that my plan didn't work and I couldn't get rid of the seagulls. But what happened was, I went round and floater fished for the carp anyway. The seagulls did me. Everything was a disaster. Carp disappeared. And then later on that evening, I found the carp in the area where I've been shoveling all of these biscuits, but on the other side, right? So when you're not allowed to bivvy up on the other side, you have to cast across. So I thought, right, that's okay, the carp around there. So I got in. The only place you could put your rods, it was this gap in the reeds, was where all these biscuits were, right? So I put my 3 rods in there, cast them across. Well, all night, these 2 swans were wiping out my rods all night. They had them off the alarms. There was nothing. It was the most, I just nearly lost my, it was savage. So that was another mission that went completely wrong. Anyway, back to the first couple of sessions, there were some major opportunities on floaters that I couldn't capitalise on. And fish were getting caught by other members of the syndicate. And it was clear that the stealthy approach of just fishing a few boilies where I'd seen a fish just wasn't working for whatever reason. And at the end of my first or second trip, I found the king of the lake, Tyson, in a marginal situation. And before I left, it was the end of my session, before I left I waded out and tipped a whole bottle of krill liquid, pure neat krill liquid, into the stones and the sand where he was, and then I crumbed up a few boilies, and not many, like literally like 10 boilies, and left it. And when I came back the following session, that was obviously a place I was very keen to check out, and got up this willow and looked along the margin and waited a while, and he came in again, this giant common. I say he came in, it was a massive, massive common, 50 pounder, so it must have been him. And it didn't drop on the spot, but he did a circle. I'm bearing in mind this is a week later. So obviously I got myself in there, got everything sorted out, but where the spot was, you couldn't cast to it, and it was almost too deep to wade. But after a bit of swimming stroke, I had an accidental swim, and eventually I got a rig on the spot, fished it with a big drop-off lead, and probably 3 hours later that rod was away, and it's whipped up really tight. The rod's compressed right round, massively violent take, and the fish was gone. And the great big lead I had on was gone, and that was the first bite I had. And I don't know whether it was him or what it was, but it was the worst possible way to start a new campaign. And you know, any loss is savage, but when you have an opportunity on a spot you've seen a really big fish and it results in that, it's incredibly crushing. But moving on from that, I felt I'd learned something, you know, about baiting situations and what they were and weren't willing to pick up, and maybe what I was doing needed to change a bit. I made a couple of small changes, a couple of rig changes as well. It was the following trip after that, which I think was my third session, when it started to come together. And I'd caught my first fish from the lake, which was this incredible, really old, original, it was bearing the scars of otter damage, this fish from years ago, but a lovely dark mahogany 35-pound carp, which I caught out the edge. And one of the things that I changed and I started to do more of, pretty much actually from the get-go, was to focus on the near shelf and the near distance. Not the near, what does that even mean? The near distance, the shorter area. So the lake is, a lot of the main part of the lake is very square. So there's an area out in the middle of the lake which is very, very popular with anglers, and you fish at about 100 or so yards, and there's 4 or 5 swims that cover that area, and it gets an enormous amount of pressure. And most of the fishing, if it wasn't doing that, it would still be fishing out at range from one of the other swims, and you rarely saw anyone fishing at less than 70 yards, and usually there were a lot more than that. And I determined from the get-go I was going to fish a lot closer. And that first bite that I lost, that was obviously in the edge. And then the first fish that I caught on the following session, this amazing 35-pound common, was right in the edge. And I followed that up with one of the stocky mirrors. They'd put in 4 or 5, I don't remember, 5 I think, stocky mirrors the previous winter, which were doing reasonably well, and I caught one of those, which I was quite pleased with. They don't get caught very much, so I was pleased with that. And obviously to have a 35-pound common as well, that was a proper red letter morning. And that was on my last morning of the trip. It was a 2-night limit in place, and it was on the last morning. But I had the rest of the day, and there was a new wind scheduled to blow into a particular corner, and it was an unusual wind. It was a northwesterly, and it was only supposed to be blowing for the day, but we hadn't had a northwesterly for quite a period of time. You know, when you get a new wind that is an unusual direction and you haven't had that for a while, it can be significant. So I packed up that morning about 7 in the morning. I thought, you know what, I'm going to move around on the end of this wind and just fish the rest of the day. And got round the other side of the lake where this wind was going to blow, and I positioned 2 rigs right in the edge, baited them very lightly, and with the new rig setup that I was using. They weren't really in a swim, but they were in an area where I'd seen fish activity before. There wasn't a swim there, but I've got these 2 rods in the reeds, and then once I've got everything sorted, I thought, well, I'm not going to sit here, because any anglers that come along around the lake, it's obviously a busy lake, they're going to stop and talk to me, and I've got rods there, so I don't want that. So I went down to the nearest swim, which was about 50 or 60 yards to the left, set myself up there with my kettle and my sounder box and my little day chair. And the next few hours unfolded. The wind eventually did come, much later than the weatherman said, and probably only about an hour and a half before I had to go, but it did start rippling in, not much, 8 or 9 mile an hour, but started to see the odd show. They did react to it quite quickly that day. A lot of the time here they don't, but that morning they did. And by now a few people have started walking around, people arriving for the weekend and so on, and I've got a few people stopping to chat and have a cup of tea and so on and so forth. Another slider, another one, and it started to look like it was really good for a bite. And I was wishing I hadn't seen anything shown into the margin where the traps were set. They were more out in open water a bit, but you know, it looked good. And I was just wishing I had longer than about 90 minutes that I had left or so, maybe an hour left. It was interesting actually. The guys who were there are all what I call long in the tooth carp anglers. They've all been doing it since at least the 80s, you know, and a couple of longer than that. So between us, we had a lot of grey beards and carping years between us, which the significance of that will become clear in a minute. But so we're all sat there just chewing the fat, and suddenly the sounder box goes. And you know, it actually just gave me a shot of adrenaline, that taste in your mouth just then, just thinking about it. And I'm obviously out there like a bat out of hell, run down the bank, and it's the right-hand rod of the pair. I had the tips up because of the reeds, and it's absolutely savaged over like a barbel bite on a match rod, and going. So I ran down the bank, picked up the rod, and made contact with the fish. Within obviously 30 seconds or so, all the other guys, 4 or 5 people, have come down to see what was going on, and they're all stood behind me, and it didn't feel very big. There was a couple of quick head shakes and that, and so I turned around, so I said, it's not a big one, but happy to get a bite, and carried on playing it. And the longer the fight went on, the more I realised that those words that I had said were completely and utterly wrong. And this fish went from something that was shaking its head violently and didn't feel particularly impressive to really heavy, slow lunges. And after about 10 minutes or so, it breached 40 yards out in front, facing away from us. And you just saw this huge set of shoulders, you know, like that, across, black, facing away, and a big boil on the surface, and it flat rodded me. And the fight was absolutely incredible. Eventually I managed to get it round. One of the lads has thrown me the net, and I've waded out as far as I could, put the net, and this huge thing has come over the jaw cord. I didn't know what it was obviously at that point, but the lads on there, you know, out of that group, there was only me and another guy who were new guys. The other guys knew the fish, and they'd shuffled forward and looked into the net, and there was a lot of quiet, sort of like jaw-dropping silence, if you like. I'm like, wow, and so it turns out that this fish had not been caught for a year, and before that it was so rarely caught that actually they thought it was dead. And it was a fish called Geordie, which many people, myself included, would say is really the king of the lake in terms of aesthetics. It's an absolutely jaw-dropping, pristine, massive carp. And together, I mean, the lads were brilliant. They all helped me out, and because I was I don't smoke, and I'm scrounging cigarettes like I'm a chain smoker, trying to calm myself down. I couldn't have, you know, the lads took control and helped me out, and I really needed that because my head was totally gone. I mean, this fish was mind-blowing, and we weighed it obviously, and it's gone 48 pound 14 ounces, which is massive, and more importantly, it was incredible to look at. So we had this ragtag group of old greybeard, long in the tooth carp anglers kneeling around this fish, all of which are, you know, these guys have been doing it a long time, but we were all collectively hushed into an awe and silence that you very, very rarely see or experience on the bank. These guys have done it all and seen it all, and we were all, it was an amazing moment to behold. We did a bit of footage of the carp and ran off some stills, and then I waded out and let it go, and to this day, one of the finest carp I've ever caught. So I've moved the rods earlier into this swim and I've just got the rest of my kit round here now. It's a lovely feel round here. It's a bit sun blasted and several degrees warmer than it is round there in that shady little nook that we were in. So whilst we're waiting for things to unfold, waiting for something to show us what to do next, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what unfolded this summer. Less than 6 months ago. It seems like a long time ago, but we're going back to June, July, that sort of phase. So after the capture of Geordie, I learned quite a lot about a type of presentation and rig that was going to be effective for these fish. When you bear in mind that Geordie is a very rarely caught fish, I knew that the tweaks I'd made were going to work. You know, they were significant. If they were significant enough to cause the downfall of that fish, then it was something to run with, as was the bait combination, everything that went with it. So I'd suddenly gone from a couple of tough sessions to 3 fish in a trip, and I felt I was up and running, and unfortunately I didn't really look back from that point. A few more tailored tweaks and so on, but it gathered momentum, and I started catching fish with regularity, notching up a couple here and there every trip. The next really significant session that really powerfully stands out in my mind was a trip that coincided with some really good weather, and it was probably about the second week in July. I'd have to check my diary, but I'd gone into a swim that had a lot of carp activity in it over the preceding, certainly the time I'd been there, but I'd been told by other members of the syndicate that it was an area where you often saw the carp, but they didn't seem to get caught very much. In fact, it was the same swim that I'd done my first ever night on the lake in. Commands a good view of water, and it's a part of the lake that is festooned with natural food. It's really heaving with naturals, and the carp get in there a lot and they show a lot there, but for some reason, or for those reasons probably, they're very hard to catch there. And at that point, there hadn't been a carp caught from that swim for the entire of this year. And I think last year it was similarly hard from what I've been told. But on this particular session, there were fish in there, and I always fish where they are. I'm never worried. You should never worry about previous form. Just fish where the fish are and try and work it out. After a bit of light leading around, I found a lovely little pocket of clay coming back on the lead, which is always of significant interest, and there's a few on this lake, and they've all stood me in really good stead. Very small areas that require quite accurate fishing, but as I mentioned before, I was determined that I was going to fish wherever possible as close to the bank as I could, just because it was an area that was totally unexploited from what I could see. So I found this lovely little zone about 40 yards out and baited it up, put 2 rods on it, and then I had another spot about 25 yards away that I put 1 rod on with a lot less bait. And the session was just one of those where everything just really fell my way. I was very fortunate, and I ended up with 6 fish in total. But the leviathan of the session, the moment where something incredible happened, which was the first seismic shock really after the Geordie occurrence. It was the second morning. I had a lot of fish coming into the swim. I've got video of on my phone of what I believe was Tyson rolling about 10 yards off the left of the spot, and I was just sitting there, light rain coming down, fizz coming off the spot, and these just massive fish just rolling around the spot. I mean, it was electrifying, and to this moment now I'm thinking, I'm reliving it. It was one of the absolute highlights of the year. And that night the weather got a bit better, the wind pushed a bit stronger, but the fish seemed to drift away. I caught one on the evening, they drifted out a little bit, and for some reason this lake just didn't seem to do night bites until the autumn. It was all about the day, so I wasn't too worried. They seemed to push off and go down the middle of the lake a little bit, and I thought, well, they'll spend their night out there and I'll prime everything, have everything set for the morning. Now at this point I'd had 4 fish off the main spot where I had 2 rods, and on the smaller spot to the right, which I told you about, where I had 1 rod on this tiny little clay spot, I hadn't had a bite on that at all. But it was really just there, you know. The spot that I was interested in was the one that was doing the bites. That was the one the fish that had been rolling around and fizzing on and showing a lot of interest in. And now at this point, it's worth just covering that there is one of the big fish in here is an enormous common tinged with ghosty called otterbait. He's quite a pale fish in coloration, hence the name. There used to be otters in the area, well, there are still otters in the area, but the lake didn't used to be fenced, and they used to lose a few every year to the otters. They used to surmise that otterbait was the most likely to get taken next, simply because he stood out in amongst all the other blacker fish. So, but this particular carp is he's got massive eyes, huge pair of eyes, perfect mouth, very small mouth, and at this point, so this is June, he hadn't been caught since I think the previous autumn, but a rarish visitor to the bank anyhow. And a lot of people were speculating on how big it might be, that he had been seen quite a lot and looked very big. And that night, in fact, I thought I caught him. I caught a 40-pound one tinged with ghost carp a couple of weeks earlier, really long common, and it was 40 pound 4 ounces, I think. And when he was in the net, I thought, oh my God, I've caught otterbait. How have I caught this, like one of the real rare ones straight after Geordie? But then when I turned it over, it didn't have much depth. I realised it wasn't. But this night was different. And right on first light, 4 a.m, so it was the beginning of it was a little bit more dark than it was light. The rain was coming in, I had the door zipped up, the rain was coming, the wind was coming in, it was warm, it was perfect. And the bite was just sensational, because I had the sensitivity set just right so I wouldn't get any single bleeps, and it was fairly low on sensitivity, and it just went bib, 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 like that. And I came out in my boxer shorts. It was a real warm night, even though it was wet and windy, and I came out and it was this right-hand rod on this tiny spot, and I connected with this fish, and it pretty much flat rodded me, immense power, and went across the bay and kept on going and going and going, and I knew from that moment it was something really serious, and it was a very lengthy, drawn out fight, which fortunately ended in my favour. And this time when I looked in the net, there was no doubt about it. It was this great common called otterbait. I sorted it out myself and weighed it myself, and did a little bit of film and footage of it when it got light, and the fish weighed 48 pounds and 2 ounces, which I'm sure you agree, it's more than big enough for me anyway. Breeze block of a unit of a carp.
Well, this is a fish known as otterbait. This slightly pale coloration made him a possible target for the otters when they were on here, but luckily the place is fenced in now, and these magnificent beasts are protected. 48 pounds and 3 ounces. I don't care if I don't catch another carp again, absolutely, well, speechless. Thank you.
On the spot where I'd had all the activity, where I had the 2 rods, I was putting a slightly different combination of bait to what I was on the tiny spot with 1 rod. And when I caught him off the little spot, he was crapping on the the bait that I had on the main spot. So he'd clearly been in and getting away with it, you know, quite clear, as probably Tyson, maybe, you know, various other fish had, because there was a lot of feeding activity, but he had clearly been, and then on his way out, he's probably thought, hello, I'll just stop and have that, and luckily I caught him. And well nailed on the rig adjustment was doing me proud. Everything was coming on that setup, and yeah, to get 6 fish in one session from a lake that's got about 45 fish in it was again beyond my expectations, and I left with a huge buzz, having not only ticked off another one of the real big uns, but a fish that's quite rare, and in those 2 captures, Geordie and otterbait, I had accounted for the 2nd biggest and the 3rd biggest carp in the lake in quite a short period of time. So filled with enormous confidence, and the summer was all to play for.
Holy shit, there are some monsters down here. Massive great submarines ghosting through. We found them. This is the spot we need to be in. Three rods, three chances. What I would call a Labrador head, big black, just came out, breached like that and went back down again, maybe 20 foot left of my near spot. This is exciting. It's like the wind stopped, the atmosphere is electric, the fish are still here. That was a very big one. Well, the atmosphere is really ratcheting up now. We've seen quite a few fish in the last hour or so, bubbling, fizzing and rolling, and that great big head that came out not too far away from my close-in rod. It just feels like something's building. It's electric, really. The cloud's getting thicker, things are happening, the rods have gone in perfect, and the fish are still here. It's really, really intense. It's definitely time for the lucky shirt. Look, oh, that one was really big. That was a smaller, more subtle one, but oh, look, the swimmer's alive. F***ing rod's gone in. Shit. Well, that was a very, very violent bite from what could be a really, really big fish. Okay, he's on the surface. I cannot tell how big it is. It's so dark out there. The bite was very violent. I'm going to say it's just getting in, but my mouth is dry. My knees are knocking and my heart is thumping. This is what it's all about. A bite in the darkness. You're attached to something that could be the fish of your dreams. It's taking a bit of line. Let's just hope we can get him in the net. My mouth is dry as a flip-flop. Let's just, come on baby, please. It's not one of the monsters, but he's certainly putting up a good account. Just praying he'll come in the net, but here he is. Yes, come on, thank you. Thank you, carp gods. Wow. I never ever thought we would get a fish on the first night. This is serious business. To get a fish this early in the session is monumental. This is a difficult lake and we've got one, and the last few hours, you know, I've been pacing up and down the swim, watching the fish, you know, they've been fizzing, they've been rolling out on the spot, and it's a pressure cooker situation, and every time a fish goes like that and more patches of bubbles come up, it ratchets up the tension a bit more, and you're waiting and you're praying that something's going to go. Finally it did, and you're released almost like out of that prison and you're doing battle, and now I feel liberated. You know, everything's working, we've got one in the net and we can move forward. It's monumental. 27 pounds, 10 ounces. Absolutely buzzing with that. Fantastic. Well, this fella is 30 years old easily. Very powerful fish, big head, big shoulders. Like I said, old, coveted, very desirable. We're off the mark, and I'm very, very happy with this fella. Throughout the passage of life, early morning usually means going to school, going to work, rushing about, noise, traffic, mayhem, especially if it's in my house. But here it's just total and utter tranquility, tendrils of mist rising off the surface, just utter solitude and peace. Like the weather has just been cancelled today. There's nothing, there's no wind, there's no rain, there's no sun, there's nothing, and it's very, very quiet, and I don't like that. We're in. Well, it started off going to plan, and then there was this huge lull that we've had since 3 AM through dawn up until now, and it was just looking like I might have to completely reassess and maybe move. And they were there, no bubbles coming up, not a fish showing, and then out of the blue, what feels like a very good fish has just stormed off, and big tail just came up in the middle of the lake, and he's very powerful and very, very angry. Well, this is really going to plan. It's surpassed my expectations already, but it's not over yet. I really need this fish to go into the net. The dry mouth has taken over. This is really intense, powerful fish, and I just want it to come in now. Oh, it's got a lovely big black mouth. Come on, baby. Oh, thank you, carp gods. Thank you. Exhilarating. Always. Never failed to take my breath away. Fish like that, black, old, armour plated. Oh, thank you, carp gods. That moment when you get to see and it's every bit that you imagine, the most perfect, sensational example of a common carp. Now these fish are really old and really special. This fish has lived in this lake all through this century, well into last century, grown in here. If I can get him up for you to have a look, you will see why I'm so excited about this. Now that is a testosterone-packed male common carp, fish that's probably lived in this lake since the 1980s. Think of all the times you've driven to work. I think of like my first day of secondary school, First day when I passed my driving test, this fish was swimming around in this lake. Perfect proportions, dark, and he's just muscle packed, wild, a bit angry, and incredibly beautiful. You know, we've been blessed really with two exceptional, gorgeous fish, but having said that, given the size of the fish in this lake, they're on the below average size. So then you question, am I doing it right? Have I chosen the best tactical route that will end with Tyson in my landing net? And not only is it the right tactic, am I up to it? Am I worthy enough to catch not only the biggest carp in this lake, but one of the biggest common carp in England right now? Bait plays a massively important role in big carp fishing. They live in an environment that is full of natural food. They don't need to eat bait to survive. So if you're going to give them something, it has to be of the finest quality. If they're not going to open their mouth, you're not going to catch them. The game's really changing now. Not only have I not seen any carp for, well, the whole day, and I don't know where they are because they don't seem to have popped up anywhere else, but more importantly, they don't seem to be here. But in the last few hours, a lot of other people have turned up. There's a lot of people on site now, and that really, really restricts options should I need to move, and it's looking like I will need to move. So it's another complexity, another problem, and yeah, it's not the best. Oh, this fish is just, it's great in the line. It's on a snag down to the left. Not a sign of a fish all day. Laid down just before midnight, heard two fish roll out on the spot, and then the right hand rods away. And this fish is beasting me. He's trying to get in this tree up to the left. Come on, please come out. Come on. And it's not big. He's welcome. Come on. Come on. Keep gulping. Come on. Oh, yes. You know what? We always say, as carp anglers, it's nice to get them in the day when you can see what's going on, everything's under control, but when you get them at night and you can't see anything, it's a total panic up. That's a real buzz. Not a monster, it's a lovely, lovely comet, another lovely comet. Whew. Okay, it's a big carp. It's our first 30 pounder of the session. 32 pounds at 8 ounces of proper Warlock common carp. Let's have a look at him, fantastic. Victory won. Took me all the way down the margin, tried to rag me round a tree, but victory was ours. 32 pound 8, a beautiful Warlock of a common, massive tail, perfect proportions, armour plating all over. That's what it's all about. Yes, Oh man, I love that. Well, that was one of the hardest, most frustratingly painful sessions ever, triple underline. The birds were impossible to defeat and cost me a couple of serious surface opportunities. In the end, the diving gulls pushed the carp away and I was left with an empty swim. By 4 p.m, I was on the road, a thoroughly beaten man, ... unhappy face emoji, badly drawn by me. I keep these because I write them every day. Anything of any significance I write down. And I do it because it's a fantastic point of reference when you're building a picture, stats, moon phases, anything. And also, I like writing, and who knows, maybe one day I'll put me in a book or something. I mean, no to read it, but maybe. My mum will. So it's been an interesting session. The big guys eluded me, but I'll be back. There's only 3 definite outcomes. He dies, I die, or I catch him. So the game, the chase, the pursuit continues. In the meantime, the best thing is still to come. So the summer progressed nicely. Everything was going according to plan, but I kid you not, it was a lot of hard work, a lot of swim moving, a lot of staring at the water, and it was graft, but everything was working. You know, the bait combination was clearly working very, very well. It was based on a combination of krill powder and calanus liquid and stuff like that. I found that pretty much whenever I moved on them, as long as I found a really, really nice piece of lake bed, which were usually very, very small little clay spots or tiny patches of shingle, and fished them accurately and baited them accurately, then the fish didn't usually push away from that disturbance. I could usually get on them, get fish in, get some bait in, and catch every trip, which was more than I expected from the outset. There were a few sessions where it'd get hard and you sort of might be at the end of your session you hadn't caught, but I could usually set it right before I left. But I remember one big weather front that came through in August, and we had a lot of rain come down. It was absolutely fantastic carp fishing conditions, and it killed the lake completely. You know, I see this more and more often now, that the better the conditions, the lower the air pressure, the better the everything, the worse the fishing is. On so many, I've seen it a lot now, and it was certainly the case up here at Grendon. And this front came in, and I'd moved on to fish and got fish in, and then on that occasion they did seem to move away. I had caught a small one, and then they'd moved away, and then I didn't see anything for quite a while, and I stayed where I was for about a day, and because I thought they might still be around, didn't see anything, and then the rain came, and it came and came and came, absolute deluge. So I got the handheld umbrella and I'm walking around, a swim down that way, a swim down that way, with the sounder box looking and fully waterproofed up, and you know, just looking for an opportunity, and didn't see anything for most of the morning. They don't normally show early anyway, and I went round a corner so I could look up the lake a little bit more for a better view, and after standing there for about half an hour or so, I saw one show over in an area where I really didn't expect, and just as I was zoning in on it, another one showed. And that was it. That was a massive opportunity. So, and it was a horrible pack up because it was steroids. It was proper movie rain coming down. But luckily on here you can move by van. You know, it's not barrow work. Although that obviously that wouldn't have stopped me, but it made life a bit easier. So you just throw everything in the van, just a mess of mud and water and slop, and got myself round to that zone where the fish were showing. As I arrived in there, another one shone, and it was an area that really I hadn't seen them in before, and
wasn't particularly noted. Not that that really means anything. The fish were clearly there were patches of fizz coming up, and it was after being quiet for 24 hours that it clearly switched on in a big way. And I got into the swim, and there was a spot that I knew down the left hand margin, which was one of those small little clay craters. Quite often I'd bring the lead back and it would be covered in little streaks, and I'd had a couple of good fish off it before. So that was the first rod I got sorted, and really tricky little cast underneath a tree, but not underneath a tree like a snag tree, just an overhanging canopy. And so I managed to get this rod in position after, I don't know, a couple of casts or whatever it was, until it went in perfectly. And then I underarmed a spod of mix, put about 4 spods, underarmed them on top, and set that. And then I set the other 2 rods, and I sat back under the brolly, tried to dry myself. I mean, I was absolutely drenched by then. Not that it mattered, it wasn't cold, it was August, it was carpy, I was on fish, I was buzzing tremendously. Anyway, I carried on watching. Every now and again you would see a little subtle nudge on the surface, or a few bubbles when the wind dropped off enough and it went calm, and you could see the water in the area was tinged as well. It was going off out there. I was getting little knocks on the lines, and which was I was fishing very slack, and I was still getting little knocks and twitches which weren't setting off the alarms or moving the bobbins, but if you just sat and watched the lines, you could see the swim was very much alive. And I was on the phone to a mate about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the rod that I had in close, I was fishing braid, and I had the clutch done up a bit too tight, and the tape pulled the rod off the rest, and the butt went up in the air, and I just managed to get hold of it. Proper noddy moment, really. I got hold of this fish, powered off down this margin towards this big overhanging snag, which was about 50 yards away, but probably about 25 yards from where I'd hooked the fish, and it went and went and went and went, and I got, you know, some pretty stout gear on, and I in the end I had to put brakes on it because it would have been game over. And luckily I did manage to turn it. It went out into open water, and then began a battle with a carp, the like of which will stay in my memory as one of the top few ever, because it was like humidly warm, the glasses were steaming up, it was pouring with rain. I was just there in a t-shirt because I had taken everything off to get dried out, and it was warm under the brolly. And obviously when I had the bite, I didn't have time to put anything, so I'm there drenched in a t-shirt, kneeling on the boards at the front of the swim, and this fish kept going up and down, and every now and again it would plough through the lake bed, and these huge bed chair sized areas of bubbles would come, fizz would come up, and it was quite incredible. And it became very clear after a short while that it was a very heavy fish, very hard to get up off the bottom. And the fight didn't really take me beyond 25 yards in front of the boards that I was kneeling on. It just plodded up and down 25 yards out, and I couldn't get it any higher in the water for about 20 minutes. It was absolutely exhilarating. It was so exciting. And eventually it did breach. It came higher and higher, and then the leader popped out, and then this black mass of shoulder plating appeared, and it was the biggest, blackest common I'd ever seen on the end of my line. And I managed to get it in the net, and I'll tell you what, I remember everything was soaked, the rain's coming down, all of the pepper in the surface, and I'm looking in into the net, and there is just this behemoth of a common, not just a behemoth of a common, but a long, dark, incredibly wide fish sat there. And after a while I realised that it was the one that I caught in the first couple of days of June or very end of May, called Geordie, arguably the best fish in the lake or even the county. And it just you know, you never want a repeat, but when you're looking at a fish that still at that point had not been caught by anyone for a year, and in the space of the preceding 2 years before that had only been caught by one person, and then somehow I've caught it twice in a couple of months. And not only that, it looks even bigger than when I caught it last time. And so I had a few moments savouring the moment with Geordie, which weighed 49 pounds 2 ounces, and I wasn't going to mess the fish about or anything, but there was no way I was going to put back a black near 50 pound common. So I did a few self takes, which was very tricky, And I think I did about 3 pictures I got of it, and then I waded her to the edge or walked to the edge and got in and let her go. And that for me was another sort of a real sort of shock of a moment, because you try and quantify the odds of a capture like that, because you try and think, well, was it the rig, was it the spot, was it the bait, was it a combination of everything? Because how do you catch a fish that's that rare twice when no one else has? There must be a reason, and a big part of the reason is bloody good luck and fortune, no doubt about it, from the carp gods. Other than that, I struggled to put my finger on why this carp had come along, but obviously incredibly glad that it had, and my lord, what a fish that is, Geordie. By the end of August, I had got something like 30 fish under my belt, which for a reasonably low stock lake, you know, that was mind-blowing to me, really. The result of a lot of hard work, and I can see it when I look in the mirror. I think I look a lot older, you know. It's been a hard campaign, but to accumulate that number of fish was incredible to me. And in 6 months, you know, the fishing, because of all the lockdown and everything, only started in June, or back end of the last 2 days of May was when I came up. So that was incredible by August to be on that number of fish. And I thought, well, do you know what? To coin a phrase, I had the proverbial bit right between my teeth. Everything was working so well that genuinely, when I came, it wasn't a matter of whether I was going to get a bite. It was whether I was going to get 2, 3 or 4. And I was loving the moment and not taking anything for granted, but it was going so well. And then it just stopped. And that was a major shock to the system. September was barren and arid. I literally went from a 3 fish trip to a 0 fish trip to a 0 fish trip to a 0 fish trip. And when you have something working as well as the combination of things that I've been doing was working, to try and recalibrate. I mean, do you know, most of the carp fishing is when you've got something going, and just don't change anything, just keep doing it, and the big uns will come. And obviously at this point, I'd not caught Tyson, although Tyson hadn't been on my periphery, on my radar at all. I wasn't thinking about Tyson, I wasn't chasing Tyson. It was all I was doing was enjoying the fishing and welcoming whatever was in my net. I only started to think about Tyson when I started to get repeats. And as I got to about 30 fish, I started to get a couple of repeats, a couple of new faces, as you would, because there's only about 45 or so in the lake. So at that point, you start thinking, right, okay, now, if I've lost him, this could be a long journey. Because at that point, to catch Geordie, which was the second biggest in the lake and the rarest twice, and otterbait, the third biggest in the lake I'd caught, and I was about to catch again, which is a great story, I'll tell you in a minute. I started to think, well, Tyson's actually a bit more friendly than both of those. Had I lost him along the way, that I'd think at that point, at this point, I think I'd had 4 losses or maybe 5. And my memory kept going back to that very, very first take on the second session, I think it was, where the rod lurched round and it shook the lead off, and I'd seen him in the area. And then you start thinking, what do you do if you've lost him? Then you've got to, and you're getting repeats by this stage, you have to try and hook him twice in a season then, or half a season, 6 months. And what are the odds on that, hooking him twice, when, you know, the rest of the syndicate collectively have hooked him twice themselves? So Tyson got caught in August by Steve, good old boy Steve, caught him at 52 pounds, which was a slight indication they had had a bit of a spawn. Cabby and I noticed there was an area of slightly damaged rushes in the arm, where a couple of fish seemed to have maybe had a go one hot night. But other than that, there was no real signs. Geordie, you know, hadn't gone backwards in weight at all. So we thought maybe just a small handful of fish have had a little bit of a go. But as I said, going into September, when something is working that well, you persevere with it. You don't have a blank and then drop it and change. You think, well, maybe that's down to other factors. So you re-employ it the following session and have a blank. And then you really start to question things. how can something go from there to zero just like that? It just didn't seem to make much sense to me. But I suppose now, retrospectively thinking about it, if you do hook, you know, the vast percentage of the lake stock on a particular thing, it is going to dry, isn't it? Carp aren't stupid, particularly on very, very pressured lakes like this. And then you also have to factor in, on top of those 30 odd fish, the 5 losses. And then you also start thinking, well, for every fish that you caught, he had a mate next to him feeding who's gone, whoa, I'm out of here. And they've got, you know, so there's been collectively a lot of bad experiences, and then it starts to make sense, and you think, well, but it's still a shock to the system that that run of something can come to an end, and you think, right, it's back to the drawing board now. What am I going to do? How am I going to somehow maintain some sort of edge to try and keep myself catching and work myself towards that final ultimate target in the form of Tyson? How do I try and avoid repeat captures, because no one really wants those? So September was a really, really tough month. Was actually, I think it was all across the country, and it was here. Very little was caught out of here, but I caught one mirror, a nice welcome mirror. There's not many in here, a nice mid-30 mirror, a really old gnarly one. And that was it. That was the last fish I caught on that tactic. I think I had 2, maybe 3 blanks on the tactic, and then on the last time I tried it, I had that fish right at the death of the session, by the skin of my teeth really. And then I thought, you know what, I've just got to walk away from this. This is this is not flicking their switch anymore. It is not happening. So before I get into October, I've just got to tell you that really in a lot of ways the highlight of the summer for me, because I achieved something that I'd been trying to do for decades and decades, and that was to catch a giant carp off the surface. It was certainly something that would beat my original PB, which was from the year 2000. So I'd always, you know, as I said, the floater fishing at Grendon had been so painful, it made you want to cry sometimes. It was so much effort and blood and sweat, and it always resulted in nothing. But I would still do it because I'm a piscatorial masochist. And I just kept doing it, and eventually I kept the float again, I kept trying it, and eventually at the end of September, I think it was the 30th of September, right on the cusp, you know, we're getting cooler nights, misty mornings, still kept the float again. We got a blast of really hot weather. It was the last day of September or thereabouts, and it went over 30 degrees, back, it just boom, absolute scorchio. And I found some fish in a corner of the lake on the surface, as I had many times, to be honest, but I thought, oh look, just you almost forget all the pain and the angst and the aggro of everything that's gone before. You think, cool, they look up for a floater. It's like someone had just done the Men in Black pen in front of me and just erased all that pain and just, oh right, oh they look like they'll have a floater, we'll have a go. So I managed to get a few of them taken, and for some reason on this particular day, probably someone somewhere within 5 miles of here was putting out a sack of floaters that did actually float and was getting mullered by gulls, and they weren't really here, and the carp were, and I managed to feed the swim very, very delicately, just with literally 3 or 4 baits for the catapult, and I got a couple of fish feeding. I got the floater rod set up, and as I'm thinking about making a cast, I noticed a big fish feeding to the left of the swim, where it was in the swim next door, and it looked quite confident on a couple of baits that had drifted that way. I thought, right, I've got to, and as I thought, I'm going to go into the swim next door, and as I've come out of the swim, Ed and Cabby were coming down the steps into us. I said, is either of you going in swim 5 next? And they went, no, and I said, see you later, I've got to go. And I ran I ran into the next swim, and sure enough, this fish was still taking, or he'd just taken one. There was a boil, and then he sort of swam to one side, and I've come in the swim and checked the hook and checked, and you look in, and as I'm looking at it, the fish just sort of cut away and just started going out into open water, and I just thought, I can't believe this. It's just stopped feeding as soon as I've walked in the swim. And I thought, well, do you know what? I'm going to make a cast, guess where he's going, and try and intercept him. So I've cast this controller and this floater out to the right and ahead of him. And it was one of those lucky casts where it just feathers beautifully, it lands with the faintest of plops. It was all laid out, could see the hook bait perfectly. And this fish, Cabby was actually, I didn't know Cabby and Ed were there. Cabby was sat behind me because he wanted to watch what was going on, and he told me, like, afterwards, he said he couldn't believe it. And we're both watching this. Fish just turned from the course it was taking, arced round to the right, came up to the floater, and I thought he was just going to go underneath it, and just nailed it. Massive set of shoulders, woof. And whenever you make a connection on floater gear, it's the sweetest thing, because floater controllers and that, just, it's all weighs nothing. It's all like fairy gear, isn't it? So when you wind it in, there's nothing there. It's not like winding in carp gear. And when you strike and that soft rod goes over and the braid starts ripping out, it's... And I've waited for this since the end of May, when I've been trying to get a bite on a floater. I've been waiting for this one moment, and finally it had happened. And the fish flat rodded me right across the bay. I've managed to get it back. Now I'm on a size 10 hook and a very light mono hook link. There's no weed or snags, so I was fishing light. And down to the right was a set of snags in the edge, like not ones that you would even really think about, but the fish kited down past them, and as I'm drawing it back towards me, I'm thinking he's going to go in there. So I started jumping out into the water and trying to gain line, and he swam out. And I thought, oh, so I've gone along the bank. Cabby at that moment jumped in, bless him, with the net. What a superstar. Didn't even take his trainers off like I had, just jumped in. And together we bundled this fish, which was pretty much beaten at that point, into the net. And it was, incredibly, it was otter bait. So otter bait, as you saw the footage, I caught him at 48 pound in summer, in July, I think. The only other person who had caught him was Cabby. Cabby done well on here this year. He had quite a few fish, and one of the ones he caught was otter bait, and he caught it off the bottom about 2 weeks before this surface occurrence. No one else had caught it, that was it. So I thought, well, I don't need to weigh it. It's a 48 pound something ounces, but I'm gonna have a picture of it, because it's a 48 pound carp on a floater, smashing my surface PB by nearly 10 pound. And I mean, I probably could fish the rest of my life and never catch a fish bigger than that on a floater. That to me was one of my greatest, most satisfying, most yearned for angling milestones of my entire life. First carp I ever caught in 1985 was on a floater, so floater fishing has always been very, very dear to me. So that was an absolute pinnacle moment, and was the highlight, arguably the highlight of the year. Certainly was the highlight of September, which was, as I said, a dire month. Only one other capture, and that was on the bottom. So I went into the autumn confused, wondering what I was going to do, and thinking, well, if I've struggled all the way through September, the autumn's going to give me a real shellacking unless I get my arse in gear. So I've got 3 rods out where I suspect the carp might be. A shorter range, they all went out nicely, good drops, and I've had a tiny little knock on the line already, which is a very, very positive sign indeed. So let's, I won't know until this evening into the night, you know, whether they're really hearing any numbers. It could just be that there's a bigger group of fish elsewhere that I've failed to realise, and there's just a couple of fish here. It could be just 4 or 5 fish in the area, and a couple of them are showed subtly. But yesterday morning, not long after first light, there was a very subtle show in front of here, about 50 yards out, followed by a couple of bubbles, and that's what's most in my mind. So we got sorted. We'll see what happens. But I'm up to reflections on autumn, really. So the summer's done and dusted. September was rock hard. We're into October. The wheels have fallen right off. All the momentum I had has lost. One minute you're sitting very proudly on a big number of fish and wondering where it will end, and then the next you realise that it has completely ended and you may not get another one for the rest of the year maybe, you know. It can be a very temperamental lake. So I took stock and learnt a couple of things about how the fish were feeding and what they were willing to feed on, and made some changes. And the first night that I actually made a couple of technical changes, I combined that with a move on to fish in the rain at about 9 in the evening. I've been moving on to fish all the time really since the first day I set foot on this place, and usually it paid off. But as I said, through September it had been very, very difficult. And this particular evening, beginning of October, it was the last night of my trip, and I'd been on fish in other swims, really on them. Had them sliding out up to the gills in the pitch darkness. You see these big black triangle heads, excuse me, right over the traps, nothing. And on the last night I tried something completely different. It just in my back of my mind seemed a logical thing to do, and I moved on to fish, got the rods out, and it was one of those, the end of another grueling session, numerous swims, extreme sleep deprivation, several weeks of really hard fishing, which when you normally is not a problem, but when you have several weeks of really hard fishing after the fishing I've been fortunate enough to enjoy, it's a real shock to the system. It's back down to reality with a massive smack round the chops with a wet kipper. And you sort of, at the end of this session, I was on the last night and I'd moved again in the wet, and everything was muddy and I was tired and everything was soaking, and I got in a sleeping bag and I thought, you know what, I don't know, I just feel like I'm going round in ever decreasing circles and getting nowhere. And I was just certain I was going to wake up to a blank. I was going to go home, lick my wounds, recalibrate again and come back with something different the following week. And about 6 AM, just before dawn, just on first light, I had an absolute nosebleed of a take, which really shocked me and surprised me. My first bite in a few weeks. From there, things changed. I had a brace of upper 20 mirrors that morning, and it was one of those rare sort of mornings where I caught one. I just weighed it in the sling, and then the other rod went. So I put the sling in the water, secured it, played the other fish, got it out, and I was sorting myself out for self takes, and Tim's walked into the swim and seen me sorting a fish out, and he's gone, it was one of them classic ones. It's a bit annoying really. Have you had one then, mate? And I went, no. And he's looked at me like, well, what are you doing then? I said, well, I've had 2, which was quite a rare thing, you know, especially going into the autumn. It had been so hard. And so from that point on, the tactical change, the only thing that didn't change was the endless graft. You know, the more the season went on, the more graft I had to put into it to keep on the fish, to keep ahead of the fish, to keep presenting myself with chances. And the fish kept coming, you know, from that point up until this session now, which is like a week or so before Christmas. This is probably going to be my first blank, which is mind-blowing to think that I managed to find another combination of something which found a real chink in their armour collectively of the fish in here, which allowed me to not only keep catching good numbers of fish, but allowed me to also catch new fish that I'd not caught. And although I've had a lot more repeats again, I've caught some really, really desirable carp that I really wanted to get to meet, some very rarely caught ones. So the change paid off in a really big way. And again, now as I sit and reflect on the year, and I think not only was I incredibly lucky to find something that worked so well in the first instance through June, July and August, but then to have to reassess and by really good luck find something else that really floated their boat, and that kept the bites coming. And the two tactics totally different to each other. But so as I sit here now, I mean, it had been a very, very bountiful October and November, but again, it was all based around nocturnal manoeuvres. The fish would be very active at night, very little happening in the day, and you had to be entirely prepared to move, as you do at any time. But I mean, you know, quite often I'm moving at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night in the rain, almost always. But almost every session would begin with standing with a handheld umbrella in the rain, listening and walking and listening and walking and listening, and then ending up setting up in the dark where they are rather than setting up in the light on guesswork. And every week they'd be in a different place because there isn't much weed, so the fish were moving around a lot, and they'd be in a different area all the time. So I always used to think, like, you know, where are they going to show next? Where am I going to next see a carp? So I guess I think, right, choose an area in my mind, that's where I'm next going to see one. And every single time I was wrong. Every time. I never got it right. Even on this trip as well, you know, it's just been, they always surprise you. So I wouldn't really say that I was in tune with the place because I always got it wrong. So if you're not in tune with somewhere, then you're always going to have to come back to good, solid graft and not be afraid of whatever that entails. So to that end, it has been a very, very hard couple of months fishing. Very little sleep, very lot of mud and very lot of rain and uncomfortability, but totally paid off with some incredible carp, which of course make all of that, every second, totally worthwhile. And as I went through the months, I caught, I had a 43 pounder, which was on the very final night, 6 moves in one session, and they were just running me ragged. Every time I got near them, every time I set near them, every time I put some bait in, they would just melt away. And on the very last night, I moved on to some fish that had finally started to show repeatedly, I should say, in a particular zone. And I think the difference between that and the preceding few nights was there was confidence in numbers. There was a lot of fish that night. It was the last good show that I saw, end of October, and they were boshing all night. Real big uns. It was electrifying. Big swells of ripples coming across in the dark, and I moved on to them about 11:30 that night, got rods on them, and had a take just before dawn, and it was an incredible 43 pounder, and that was definitely a highlight. A fish that I went on to have a recapture of only about 4 weeks later at 45.11. So proving the fish were massively on a munch. And you know, if you're talking a 45 pound common carp, yeah, it's a repeat, but you know, I'll take it. So the recaptures were punctuated with new fish, and there was one particular night, back end of November, just before the cold weather arrived, when again I managed to find them in the dark. And you're reliant entirely on how tuned in your senses are, because first you've got to hear them. So really windy nights were the worst to find the fish. You could still do it, but you had to be tuned in. You know, in the evenings, if I'm hungry, I wouldn't even eat something crunchy. It sounds so stupid. I wouldn't eat an apple or anything that was going to affect what I could hear. So I'd have a banana or so. I know it sounds stupid. You'd never use a radio. You'd never do anything that could interrupt the possibility of hearing a carp slosh over in the dark, and you would never be sat in the dark looking at your phone just using your ears, because if a fish did roll, then your eyes would go up from the screen and your night sight shot to pieces. And you need to be able to instantly combine sharp visual acuity with good hearing and be able to assess quickly what it was in line with and assess how far out you thought it was. Because you know that then you would clip your rods up, and I think the fact that I managed to catch fish on every trip meant that I don't do many things well, but I was obviously doing that reasonably well, and that assessment of where the sound was coming, because it was so dark some nights, you know, you had to make an educated guess on where that sound had come from. And of course, a lot of the time, you know, you've got a fish showing out, you know, they could be a long way away sometimes, and then you would go down, you walk around the lake, stand in a different area, and then maybe wait an hour till the next one, sometimes longer, and you would narrow it down like that. But that was the way that I angled it. And this particular night, it was amazing, because they showed on 2 different spots. One was the faintest of shows just on dusk, an oily swirl. Could have argued on any other lake there was a tench or a big roach, but it was a carp.
very subtle, just as the light was going 80 yards out to my right. So that was one rod sorted. Didn't put a rod out, because that was the other thing. If you saw a show, you would never then go, right, I've seen one, let's get the rods out and put them in that area, because then you're fishing with 3 rods to one show. And as soon as you make a cast, you will never see another show again, even though they would quite often stay in the area, not always. So once you've seen one, that's only one rod that's sorted. So usually I would then stand there for another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours before I would see another 2 occurrences, hopefully, to get 3 rods sorted. And you can imagine in your mind, you know, the difference then is that you've got 3 rods sorted, each one where there's been a sign, rather than having 3 rods sorted where you've only seen one. So if there's an opportunity to see a carp, and during that evening period there was, I would never see one and get fishing. If you see one, you wait to see more, and you wait and you wait and you wait. And then if 3 hours have passed and you've still only seen the one, then that's what you do. But quite often there'd be more. And this particular night I saw this swell. That was in my mind. I noted the tree. I thought it's about 80 yards. And then later on in the evening, I heard one bosh out more in front at about 100 yards. So I thought, okay, waited another, probably only, but didn't wait much longer after that, because I thought, right, that's 2 sorted. So I put a rod on each, and then put the 3rd rod off the side of where I'd heard this big fish about 100 yards in front. And I started getting liners straight away. And about 10 or 11 o'clock that night, the one that I've cast to the big sounding fish at 100 yards has gone. Over a little bit of bait, not much. And the minute I connected with this fish, it was absolutely epic, because I contacted this fish, and I kid you not, for the first 10 minutes of what turned out to be a 25 half an hour fight, 25 minute, half an hour. The first 10 minutes, I didn't even get one turn on a reel. I don't think I've ever had that happen before. Not even half a turn, nothing. The fish would either hold its weight and just hold, or it would slowly be ticking. And I knew it was clear it was a very, very significant fish. You're praying it's not going to be a repeat. You're praying it's going to, and at this point, because I've had quite a few repeats, I'm praying it's going to be the one. But also hoping that, you know, there are still now 10 fish in here that I haven't caught that I really, really would like to catch. So you're thinking, could it be one of those? And so eventually I've managed to get some turns on the reel, and a fish has come in. Eventually I've netted it, and I've looked in the net, and there is a really, really big fish. For a minute I thought it might be him, you know, in the headlight, in the torchlight, head torches, sometimes you can deceive and beguile yourself. And anyway, I looked over the fish, and it turned out to be the fish that from the very minute I joined was the one that I wanted to catch. Jamie sent me pictures of all the stock, and there was just this one common that really, really stood out. Don't think I'd seen a picture of Geordie, otherwise I probably would have gone, but this particular carp I just fell in love with from the first minute. And I remember texting him back earlier in the year when my ticket hadn't started, saying, what's this carp called? He's the one. That's a George. And there he was in my net. And he weighed 43 pounds and 14 ounces and is the most incredible carp. Certainly up there with the greatest big carp, big commons that I've been lucky enough to catch. From the minute I first set eyes on this fish, it was the one I wanted to catch most out of the whole lake. He's not the biggest, he's one of the biggest. He's 43 pounds, 14 ounces of November, incredible, big shouldered, mahogany, withered fins. The perfect common. Thank you, carp gods. I was due to do some filming the next morning. There was no way I was going to keep it. It was 10 o'clock at night. So I rang the guy, and very, very kindly he agreed to drive up from Sussex. So I kept the fish in the sling. He was aiming to arrive about midnight. While I'm getting myself sorted out, the right hand rod cast to this oily swirl on from the fish that I saw on dust. That's pulled up and started taking line. Wow, incredible. Played this fish, it came in without any histrionics, and netted this short, fat one. Lovely looking fish, but didn't realise at that point that this was a fish that I'd been craving all year. I'd seen it caught, it'd only been caught once all year, like the other one, I think. and it's a fish that my mate Cabby had caught, and he was the only angler that caught it. It's a real rare one, short, fat, perfect mouth, perfect everything, big tail, and I weighed that was 39 pounds 6 ounces, so quite a brace, 2 new ones. And it was only when Luke came up and we got the fish out after midnight, and I'm you know, did the short fat one first, and I'm looking at it on the mat, looking at every detail of it, and I'm going, look at it, Luke, it's amazing. It's got withered fins, big fat belly, and I'm going, I wonder which one could it be? I said, he's got a white tip tail and the bottom lobe is bigger than the, oh my God, the bottom lobe's bigger than, and then the penny dropped, and I went, it's baby dog, it's baby dog, it's baby dog. And I lost it at that post game, and it was like one of the greatest carp in the lake, one of the rarest, and one that I really, I'd seen Cabby holding it at 35 pound, and yeah, incredible, and braced with the other one that I wanted almost more than any other. So that was a very memorable November brace, and the highlight of the autumn, you know, not discounting the other big fish, you know, and there were several others. I mean, I've been very lucky. Big 30s. Fish. There's a fish in here called Nick, probably the oldest known carp in the lake. Once was the biggest, and now he's gone backwards because he's so old. He had made a few people's seasons, you know. He'd probably been the friendliest carp this year out the lake, and I'd never caught him, and I couldn't understand how, you know, by now I'm up to like 40 carp now, and I'm thinking, how have I not caught Nick? He was a lovely, beautiful old Neem Valley common. And I braced him one morning with a 38 common, and Nick was 39.11, and two very different fish. The 38 was quite a golden colour but beautiful shaped head, and the eye socket was just perfect. The shape of its eye was sort of sunken in a bit, and lovely carp. And Nick himself, different, grey, old, 39.11. That was another I think that was the end of October. Very memorable morning, and a fair few others I was very fortunate enough to have come my way, and a few more repeats, and a couple of other new ones. I had a lovely 28 and so on and so forth. But it's got to the point now where it's Christmas next week. The carp gods, thank you, have blessed me with no fewer than 47 captures from this lake, which in a 6-month period with a stock of 45 fish is incomprehensible to me, you know. You think a good season out of a stock like that would be 20 fish, you know. So I don't know what's happened. It's been really hard work, maybe that and the luck from the carp gods have shone on me, I don't know, but it's been memorable, and the chase and the hunt and the dream for Tyson goes on, but there are others. There's a fish out there called the Old Grey. There's a fish called Scargill. There's the long common, there's the immaculate common, neither of which have been caught since last year, and they're 40 pounders, you know. The fish are all up in weight. There could be, there's 3 50s out there now. I mean, Otterbait will be over 50 now. Geordie will be over 50. Tyson has done 56. So, you know, one of the ones I haven't caught, the long common, the immaculate, Scargill. There's a few, there's 10 fish that I counted up that I haven't caught that I would really love to catch. And if you take the recaptures off the tally of 47, take those back, probably takes you to about 35, 36 fish, and then you add the 10 on I haven't caught, so it's about right. So I'm never going to get a full house, but I can sit here and dream of an unknown one that I haven't caught, or maybe even Tyson himself. December can be a good big fish month, and I'm thinking maybe, you know, I'm fishing for potentially the biggest carp I've ever caught in my entire carp fishing life, and that in itself is a massive buzz. So I'm going to go into tonight with hopes and expectations, as I always have. I might end up moving tonight, who knows what it's got in store, but I've got a bit of rain come over. As winter conditions go, I'll take these, it's not bad. I've had a little liner on the left-hand rod. I've got a hot cup of Earl Grey, and yeah, whatever the carp gods have in store for me, I'll take gratefully, and it's been a great journey.